The Navari were a quiet and peaceful race that lived on a soft blue world far away from the center of the galaxy. They loved music and art, and believed that kindness was stronger than any weapon. They had no armies and no soldiers because they never needed them. Their planet was covered in glowing rivers and tall glass trees that sang when the wind passed through. And for many ages they thought the galaxy was a place of beauty and peace. They sent ships to share songs and poems with other worlds, and they welcomed anyone who came to visit. But peace never lasts forever, and one day the Rethar Empire came from the dark space beyond the rim. The Rethar were cold and ruthless creatures with ships built only for war. They came without warning. They burned the sky and dropped fire on cities that had no shields. The Navari had never fought before, and they did not know how to fight. Now their leaders sent a message to the Galactic Council, asking for help. Their signal carried through. The stars, full of panic and hope, they begged for rescue. They said they would give anything if someone would stop the Rethar, but no answer came. The council was made of many powerful species who claimed to protect peace in the galaxy they met in, shining halls full of light and pride. But when they saw the Navari message, they turned their eyes away. They said that the Navari world was too far, too weak, too poor, and not worth the loss of ships. They said it was not their concern, and that the Navari should surrender or flee, but the Navari had nowhere to go. They had no colonies and no ships fast enough to escape. So they waited and watched as their world began to burn. Children hid in the singing trees and families fled into the caves. Where the blue rivers flowed, the Rethar hunted them down without mercy far away on Earth. The United Earth Fleet had just finished a long mission near the Orion Gate in their command center. Under the Atlantic Ocean, Captain Laura Mitchell was working, late when the strange signal appeared on her screen. It was weak and broken, filled with static, but the words could still be heard. She called for Admiral Grant Carter and showed him the message together. They listened to the voice of a Navari child, crying for help and saying, "Please someone, we are dying." Grant sat in silence as the sound faded out. Everyone in the room looked at him, waiting for his order. But he said nothing for a while. Then Laura said that they could not ignore it. She said that maybe no one else cared, but humans could not stay still while innocent people were being killed. Grant knew that the Council had forbidden any race to interfere with Rethar territory. He knew that sending ships could start another galactic war, but he also remembered the history of Earth, how humans had once been divided and had learned the hard way what it meant to stand alone. He looked at the faces of his crew and saw the same thought in their eyes, that if they turned away, they would never be able to call themselves human again. He gave the order to prepare the fleet for departure. The room filled with noise and motion. Officers moved across the floor, calling commands. Ships were powered up and coordinates were locked into the jump gates. Laura smiled slightly. She knew what this meant. They were going to fight for a people they had never met. Within hours, the great ships of Earth began to gather in orbit, the battleships of the Horizon Line, the carriers from the Pacific Command, and dozens of small escort vessels from every human nation all came together. The engineers worked through the night loading supplies and weapons. The pilots checked their systems. The soldiers wrote short messages to their families, knowing that they might not return on one of the ships. Sergeant Claire Hudson stood by the window, looking at the planet below. She had fought in many places and seen many wars, but this one felt different. There was no glory or gain, only the simple wish to protect someone who could not protect themselves. The fleet jumped through the gates and entered deep space. The stars stretched into lines and the ships roared forward. When they came out of the jump, they saw the Navari world below surrounded by fire. The Rethar fleets were orbiting it. Dropping burning spheres into the atmosphere, the human ships did not hesitate. They opened fire without warning. Blue plasma and guided torpedoes struck the Rethar vessels one after another. The battle began in silence and then turned into chaos. Ethan Price, who commanded one of the lead destroyers, shouted for his crew to keep formation. His voice stayed calm even when his shields began to fail. He said, "We hold this line no matter what." On the surface, the Navari people watched the sky open up. They saw strange metal birds fighting in the clouds, and they did not understand what was happening. Then the fire stopped raining, and the thunder changed its voice. They saw the Rethar ships falling from the sky, and they knew that someone had come to help. They did not know who, but hope returned for the first time in months. In the burned capital city, A group of survivors stood among the ruins and watched as silver drops fell from the clouds. Each drop opened to reveal humans wearing dark armor with blue lights on their helmets. They moved quickly and began pulling survivors from the rubble. Sergeant Claire Hudson led one of those squads. She gave water to the Navari children and wrapped blankets around them. She saw the fear in their eyes and tried to speak gently. One of the Navari elders asked her why they had come when no one else had. Claire looked around at the broken city and said, "Because we could not do nothing." The elder bowed his head and tears ran down his cheeks. He said that the humans had done more for them in one day than the council had in 1,000 years. Claire only said that they were here to stay until the Navari were safe. Meanwhile, in orbit, Laura Mitchell coordinated the rescue missions while the battle still raged. Admiral Carter kept his focus on the larger fleet movements. The Rethar tried to regroup, but the humans pressed forward harder than anyone had ever seen. Their ships moved in patterns that confused the enemy. They sacrificed their own armor to save civilians. They took damage again and again but refused to retreat. One Rethar commander sent a transmission to the human fleet saying that they would be destroyed like all others who resisted. Laura replied, "You can destroy us, but you will never break us." And then she cut the channel and led another strike. The Navari who survived began to believe that maybe they could live again. The children started to come out of hiding. The humans built shelters and shared food and medicine that they carried from their ships. Claire and her soldiers worked side by side with the Navari. To clear the ruins, they used human machines to lift stones and human drones to map the safest areas for survivors. Arilyn, a young Navari boy, followed Claire everywhere, asking questions about Earth, about humans, about why they cared. She laughed and said, "Maybe because we know what it feels like to be small in a big and cruel galaxy." As night came, the humans and Navari sat together around fires and looked at the sky above, filled with burning wreckage and distant lights of ships still fighting. The Navari sang a soft song of their people, and some of the soldiers closed their eyes listening to the strange but peaceful melody. Laura listened to the recording from orbit and whispered that they would not fail these people no matter the cost. The war had only begun, but humanity had already shown the galaxy something no one expected: compassion and courage, stronger than fear. And from that night the legend began that when every other race had turned away, it was humanity who came through fire and darkness to save a helpless world. The human fleet stayed in orbit above the Navari world for many days, fighting the Rethar forces that kept coming back from the dark edge of space. The battles filled the sky with flashes of blue and red, while on the ground, soldiers and engineers worked day and night to build safe zones for the survivors. The air was thick with smoke and dust, but the Navari were no longer hiding. They came out from caves and ruins to help the humans. They carried water, built shelters, and tended to the wounded. They watched the strange humans with wonder because no one had ever fought for them before, not even their closest neighbors. The humans looked tired and worn, but they never stopped moving. Their faces were dirty and their armor was scratched, but when the Navari looked at them, they saw something they had never seen before. Determination. Sergeant Claire Hudson and her team had set up a small command post near the ruins of the old capital city. She worked beside Lieutenant Eric Monroe, who was busy setting up communication relays. The two had been through many missions together. But this one felt different, because it was not about winning a war or gaining territory. It was about saving lives. Claire often looked around at the destroyed buildings and thought how easy it was to break something beautiful and how hard it was to rebuild it. She helped the Navari children who came looking for food and shelter. Sometimes she would tell them short stories about Earth, about forests and oceans, about how humans had once fought each other but learned to stand together. She said it in simple words so they could understand. Aralan, the young Navari boy, followed her everywhere. He asked about the stars, about human ships, and how they could make such bright fire in the sky. He wanted to be a pilot one day. Claire told him that maybe he could be even better than any human pilot if he kept his heart brave. He smiled and said he wanted to fight to protect his people like the humans did. She saw in his eyes the same fire she had seen in human soldiers before, and she knew that the spirit of the Navari was no longer broken up in orbit. Captain Laura Mitchell commanded the ship Horizon Dawn. She coordinated every rescue mission and every strike on Rethar positions. She barely slept and lived on caffeine and determination. Her crew respected her more with each passing day because she never gave orders from safety. She was always on the bridge, always watching the battle herself. Admiral Grant Carter contacted her daily from the flagship Resolute to discuss tactics and casualties. Each time his face looked older and more tired, but his voice remained calm. He told her that more Rethar ships were coming, and that reinforcements from Earth were still days away. He said they had to hold the line until help arrived. She nodded and said they would. The Rethar had started to understand that the humans were not like the others. They were not afraid of death, and they did not retreat. Even when outnumbered, the Rethar commander ordered the fleet to begin full orbital bombardment. They wanted to burn the humans and the Navari together. Laura saw the energy signatures rising from the Rethar ships and shouted for all defense platforms to activate. Human cruisers moved between the Rethar and the planet using their own bodies as shields. Plasma fire struck them again and again. Many ships were lost, but the Rethar bombardment failed below. The people saw streaks of fire falling across the sky and thought it was the end. But then they saw human ships holding the line like giants in the storm. On the surface, Ethan Price had landed his squadron to provide air support. His fighters swept through the canyons and forests chasing Rethar. Drones and bombers, his voice came through the radio steady and sure. As always, he said, "We are not leaving these people behind." His pilots echoed him and dived into enemy formations, destroying ships twice their size. Even when their own craft were torn apart, they fought until their last breath. Every explosion above gave the Navari courage because they knew someone was still fighting for them. The days turned into weeks, and the humans built defenses around the main Navari city using parts of crashed ships and salvaged metal. They created energy barriers and rail cannons to protect the civilians. The Navari worked beside them, learning quickly and copying human designs. They were not warriors by nature, but they were clever. They built small drones and shields under human guidance, and for the first time they started to believe they could defend themselves one night. Claire sat by the fire with Aralyn and some other Navari young ones. They asked her if the humans would stay forever. She smiled and said, "Humans never stay forever anywhere, but they always leave something behind that lasts." She told them that maybe what humans were leaving here was the belief that no one should be left alone. Meanwhile, in the Galactic Council far away in the core worlds, ambassadors of other species watched the reports of the battle. They were shocked that humanity had defied the order of non-interference. Some called them reckless. Others said they were dangerous. But a few whispered that maybe humanity was doing what everyone else had forgotten how to do. They argued in their golden halls while human ships burned in the sky. No one sent help. No one even sent supplies because they feared the Rethar more than they respected the humans. Back on the planet, a storm swept across the fields and made it hard for ships to land. Claire and her soldiers stayed awake through the night, helping the Navari keep their fires burning to stay warm in the morning. The storm cleared, and they found Rethar drop pods scattered around the valley. A new ground invasion had begun. The humans and Navari fought together side by side. It was the first time the Navari fired weapons. They trembled at first, but soon they found strength in the thought that they were protecting their families. Aralyn held a small energy rifle, his hands shaking. Claire stood beside him, firing her weapon calmly, telling him to aim at the center of the shape. She could see the fear leaving his eyes as he took aim and fired, hitting a Rethar soldier who fell into the mud. He looked at his hands in disbelief, and she told him that courage was not being without fear. It was moving forward despite it. As the battle raged, Laura received word that the Rethar were calling for reinforcements twice as large as the first fleet. She contacted Admiral Carter and asked for permission to push deeper into the Rethar formation. He told her that if she did, she might not make it back. She said she knew, but if they did not push, now the Navari would be lost again. She gathered her crew and told them that they were about to fight not for glory, but for the lives of millions. Everyone stood in silence and then saluted her without words. The fleet moved forward, engines blazing. They broke through the Rethar lines again and again, forcing the enemy to pull back. The humans lost many ships, but they never gave up. When the night came again, and the fires went out, Claire stood on the hill, looking at the stars above. She saw the trails of light where ships had died and felt the wind carry the smell of smoke and metal. The Navari gathered around her quietly. They had lost friends too, but for the first time, their losses meant something greater. They were no longer victims. They were survivors. She looked down at Aralyn sleeping beside a fallen Rethar weapon, clutching it like a promise. She smiled faintly and whispered to herself that maybe humanity had done something no one else could make a peaceful race remember: how to fight for life itself. Up in orbit. Laura sent her final report of the day to Admiral Carter. She said the planet still stands, the Nivari still live, and we are still here. Carter replied that the Council would not forget what they had done, but she said she did not care because history would not forget either. And when she looked out the window at the planet below, glowing faintly under the starlight, she felt something deep in her heart. Pride not just for the victory, but for being human, because in that moment humanity was more than a species. It was a promise to the universe that kindness and courage would never fade, no matter how dark the stars became. The war for the Nivari world had now reached the stars beyond their system. The Rethar Empire was angry and humiliated, because they had never been stopped before they gathered more fleets and began sending them through the void, hoping to crush the humans once and for all. Admiral Grant Carter watched the reports come in from the command room of the flagship Resolute. Every screen showed movement, red signals spreading like blood across the map. He knew they could not fight forever, but retreat was not an option. Earth had made its choice, and they would stand by it. Laura Mitchell's ship Horizon Dawn had taken heavy damage, but it was still fighting. Her crew had lost count of how many days had passed because they lived in constant battle. She spent her time between giving orders and encouraging her people with words that kept them going. When the ship shook under fire, she would hold the rail and tell them that they were the line between hope and extinction. On the surface, the Nivari capital had turned from ruins into a fortress. Human engineers had built walls of steel and energy cannons around it. The Nivari helped in every way they could. They carried parts, worked in the fields, and learned to use the tools. The humans brought Claire Hudson and her squad had not left the city since the first battle. They lived among the Nivari and trained them to fight when the alarm sounded. The Nivari no longer hid. They took their positions with calm eyes. The children carried supplies, the elders cooked for the soldiers, and the young stood guard with borrowed rifles. Claire watched them and felt a strange sense of pride. She thought of Earth and how humans had once fought for their own survival. And she realized that history had repeated itself, but this time they were the ones giving others the strength to rise. Ethan Price led the air division that patrolled the sky. His small fighter squadrons had become legends among the Nivari, who called them Sky Guardians. They painted human symbols on the sides of their shelters to honor the pilots who died to protect them. Every time the sound of engines roared across the valley, the Nivari looked up and smiled, because they knew it was not death coming from the clouds anymore, it was protection. Ethan was fearless, but he carried the weight of every pilot lost. He often sat alone after missions, looking at the stars through the cracked glass of his cockpit and wondering how much longer they could keep this. Up in the Galactic Council Hall, voices rose louder with every report of human victories. Some called the humans heroes. Others said they were troublemakers. One ambassador shouted that the humans were destabilizing the balance of power. Another whispered that perhaps it was time the galaxy learned from them. A few species secretly sent messages of support, but none dared to send troops or ships. The Council feared the Rethar too much yet. Behind their silence, many people across other worlds started to whisper stories about humans. Stories of courage and kindness spreading faster than any law could stop. Back on the Nivari world, a new dawn rose over the rebuilt streets. Children ran between the shelters, laughing for the first time in months. The humans had begun to teach them basic skills: how to build, how to grow crops, how to fix machines. Erilyn was always near Claire, following her around like her shadow. He had learned to speak English in small words and sometimes helped translate. Between Nivari and human soldiers, he had grown taller and stronger. And one evening, when Claire found him cleaning a weapon, he told her that he wanted to join the defense force. She smiled and said that he already was part of it, because courage did not wait for permission. That night, the Rethar launched a sudden attack. It came without warning. Their ships dropped from orbit like burning knives, cutting through the clouds. Explosions lit up the horizon, and alarms filled the air. Claire ran through the streets, shouting orders. As the soldiers took positions, the Nivari followed without hesitation. Blaster fire turned the night into chaos, but this time the Nivari did not run. They stood with the humans shoulder to shoulder, firing into the dark. The air smelled of smoke and ozone, and the ground shook under the weight of the bombardment. Ethan Price led his squadron through the clouds, destroying enemy bombers before they could reach the city. His voice came through the radios steady, as ever saying, "Hold the line. Hold the line." Admiral Carter received the distress call and ordered the fleet to regroup around the planet. Laura's ship was one of the first to respond. Even though half its systems were damaged, she told her crew that if they fell now, all their sacrifices would mean nothing. The Horizon Dawn entered the atmosphere and opened fire on the Rethar ground troops from above. Giant beams of light swept across the plains, turning the tide of battle. The humans and Nivari cheered as they saw the enemy retreat. But the victory came at a price. Several human ships were destroyed and many soldiers were lost. Claire found Ethan's fighter wrecked near the eastern ridge. He was alive but wounded. His first words were, "Did we win?" And she laughed through tears, saying, "We are still here. That means we did." When the smoke cleared, the Nivari people gathered around the surviving humans, bringing food and water. They had nothing much to give, but what they had, they shared freely. Claire looked at the faces around her and saw no fear, only gratitude. She realized that this bond between two species had become something unbreakable. She thought that maybe this was what humanity had always been meant to do, to stand where no one else would, to fight not just for themselves but for others. Up in orbit, Laura and Admiral Carter reviewed the damage reports. Their fleets were barely holding together. Supplies were running out and reinforcements were still far away. But the Rethar had also suffered heavy losses. Their empire was beginning to show cracks. Some of their lesser commanders refused orders, fearing the humans more than their own leaders. Carter said quietly that if they could hold one more week, the war could change forever. Laura agreed, but she knew that every hour meant more lives lost. She stared at the planet below, glowing faintly with fires, and thought that even if they failed, the galaxy would remember what they did here. As the days passed, the humans worked side by side with the Nivari to strengthen the defenses and care for the wounded. Claire spent her evenings sitting with Aralyn, who was now helping coordinate the food distribution. He asked her if the humans would ever leave. She said someday, but not until the Nivari could stand without them. He nodded and said that when that day came, he would make sure no one ever forgot what they had done together. She told him that was all any soldier could ask for in the council. The debates continued until one ambassador finally asked what kind of species fights for someone they barely know, and another answered the kind that remembers what mercy feels like. Those words spread across the galaxy, and even the Rethar spies reported that human courage was becoming a legend in every corner of space. One evening as the sun set over the Nivari plains, Laura visited the surface for the first time since the battle. She walked through the city with Claire and saw children playing beside human soldiers. She saw the blue rivers shining again and the glass trees growing new leaves. She said softly that maybe this world had a future after all. Claire told her that the Nivari now called the humans their sky guardians. Laura smiled and said, "Then it was worth every scar." Far away, the Rethar High Command gathered their remaining fleets. They planned one final assault to erase the humans and the Nivari together. But deep inside their minds, they knew this war had already changed everything, because humanity had shown the galaxy that compassion could be more powerful than fear, that even the smallest world could be defended by hearts larger than stars, and that sometimes the strongest armies were built not from weapons, but from the will to protect. That night the stars above the Nivari world burned brighter than ever, and in the calm silence after battle, the humans and Nivari stood together on the hills watching the sky. They had survived another day, and for the first time both species believed they could survive all the rest to come. And somewhere in the darkness between stars, the name of humanity was spoken not as a warning or a threat, but as a promise that when everyone else abandoned the helpless, it would be the humans who came through fire and shadow to stand by their side. The sky above the Nivari world had turned red again because the Rethar Empire had gathered their largest fleet yet and sent it to finish the fight once and for all. Admiral Grant Carter stood at the main screen of the flagship Resolute and looked at the incoming signals, thousands of enemy ships moving like a storm across the black. He knew there was no help coming from Earth because the reinforcements were still far away and communications were breaking down, but he also knew they could not retreat. Now the humans had fought too long and lost too much to step back. He looked at his officers and said that they would hold the line until the end because the Nivari were depending on them. And that was reason enough. Laura Mitchell was aboard the Horizon Dawn, which had been repaired just enough to fight again. Her ship was scarred and patched with metal plates from other wrecks, but her crew was ready when she looked out the window. She could see the reflection of the burning world below, and she whispered that if this was their last day, then they would make it count. On the ground, Claire Hudson walked through the streets of the rebuilt Nivari city. The humans had taught the Nivari how to fight and how to work the new defenses, and now every man and woman was doing something to prepare. The walls were lined with energy cannons, built from the parts of fallen ships, and the fields outside had been turned into mine zones to slow the Rethar landing forces. Claire stopped beside Arlen, who was now leading a group of young Nivari fighters. They were setting up barricades using metal sheets and broken vehicles. He smiled when he saw her and said that they were ready. She nodded and told him that bravery was not about not being afraid, but about standing your ground even when you were. She could see in his eyes that he understood it better now. Up in orbit, Ethan Price led his remaining squadrons through the atmosphere. His fighters were old and damaged, but still fast enough to strike at the Rethar bombers. His pilots were tired, and many had been flying without rest. But when he told them that the Nivari were watching from below, they found strength again. He said that no matter what happened, they would make sure the people below saw human fire one more time. The first wave of Rethar ships entered the upper atmosphere, firing long beams that tore through clouds. The ground shook and flames rose high, but the humans responded with every weapon. The battle became so fierce that even the stars disappeared behind the smoke. Laura ordered her ship to take the lead and ram through the center of the enemy line. Her voice came through the comms, calm and sharp. She said, "We move forward, not back." Every officer knew what that meant. On the planet, the Nivari and humans fought side by side in the burning streets. The air was filled with the sound of energy rifles and the cries of war. The Rethar ground troops landed in black metal pods and marched in rows, but they met resistance that surprised them. The Nivari, who once hid in fear, now charged with courage, their weapons glowing in their hands. Claire led them through the narrow alleys, her team covering the flanks as Arlen fired. From the rooftops, the Rethar were larger and stronger, but the humans were faster, and the Nivari knew every corner of their city together. They fought like one people, not two. The battle went on for hours until the sky turned dark again from smoke and debris. Admiral Carter ordered all remaining ships to form a shield around the planet. They moved into formation and fired until their cannons overheated. Many ships were destroyed, but they bought enough time for the surface forces to regroup. Carter looked at the battle map and saw the enemy still advancing, but slower now. Because they had begun to fear the humans, they had never met anyone who fought with such fire. He contacted Laura and told her that if they could hold one more hour, reinforcements might reach them. She said 1 hour is all we need and cut the line. In the middle of the ruined city, Claire found herself separated from her squad. The streets were covered in smoke. She could hear Arlen calling her name, and she shouted. Back as she ran through the fire, she saw a group of Rethar soldiers cornering a group of Nivari children, and without thinking, she charged forward, firing her weapon again and again. Until it overheated, she used the barrel as a club, knocking down the last of the attackers. The children stared at her in silence, then ran to her and hugged her. She smiled weakly and told them to run to the shelters. She looked up and saw Arlen running toward her with tears on his face. He said that the enemy was retreating from the east, but more were coming from the west. She nodded and told him that they would meet them together, up in space. Laura Mitchell saw the Rethar flagship moving into position. It was larger than anything they had faced before. Covered in black armor and glowing red lights, she knew it was the heart of the invasion. If they could destroy it, the rest might fall. She turned to her crew and told them that they were going to strike directly at it, even if it meant they would not return. Her crew looked at her in silence. Then every hand moved to prepare weapons. They knew what she was asking, but no one hesitated. The Horizon Dawn moved forward through the debris field. Firing all guns, the Rethar flagship returned fire and tore through their shields. The ship shook and alarms filled the bridge, but Laura stayed calm. She ordered the engines to maximum and told her communications officer to send one final message to the surface. She said, "Tell them to hold their ground. Humanity stands with them." The message was sent, and then she ordered her crew to prepare the reactor overload. On the surface, Claire heard the message through her radio. She stopped for a second and looked at the sky. The horizon turned white. As a great light spread across the clouds, everyone looked up in awe. The Rethar flagship exploded in a burst so bright that it lit the entire sky like a new sun. The shockwave rolled through the atmosphere and the enemy ships began to fall one after another. The humans on the ground cheered, and the Nivari dropped to their knees watching the fire fade away. Arlen looked at Claire and asked if the humans in that ship were gone. She nodded and said that they gave everything so that others could live. Admiral Carter watched the explosion from orbit and felt his chest tighten. He knew Laura and her crew were gone, but he also knew that they had won. The Rethar fleet was breaking apart, their command destroyed and their forces retreating. He ordered the fleet to chase them only far enough to make sure they would never come back. The battle for the Nivari world was over, but the price had been heavy. Thousands of human lives lost in a war that had not been theirs, but one that had become part of who they were. When the dust settled and the last Rethar ship fled into the darkness, the Nivari came out from the ruins. They helped the wounded humans and buried the fallen. Together they built small fires and sat in silence under the stars. No one spoke for a long time until one of the Nivari elders stood and said that the humans were no longer strangers. They were family. Claire looked at the faces around her and felt tears run down her cheeks. She thought of all the people who had died, and of Laura who had given everything, and she whispered softly that they would never be forgotten. The Nivari children started to sing their old song of hope, and the sound carried through the night, gentle and pure, rising above the smoke and broken stones. Admiral Carter sent a final message to Earth, saying that the battle was won and the Nivari were safe. He said that humanity had kept its promise to protect the helpless, no matter the cost, and that they had done what no other race with. The council would soon hear of it and judge them. But for now he only felt pride, because for all their losses they had proven something to the galaxy, that humans might be fragile and flawed, but when it mattered most, they were unbreakable. The Nivari sky glowed faintly with the light of burning wrecks, slowly drifting away, and for the first time in many generations, peace came to that world, a peace written not by treaties, but by sacrifice and courage. Months passed since the great battle over the Nivari world, and the fires that had once burned across the land were now gone, leaving behind open fields of green again. The air was calm, and the sky clear of warships for the first time in many years. Humans and Nivari worked side by side to rebuild the cities. The ruins were slowly turning into strong homes and new schools, where human engineers taught the young Nivari how to use machines and repair tools. Admiral Grant Carter had stayed behind, instead of returning to Earth, because he believed the Nivari needed someone to guide them through. This time, he often walked through the markets and smiled when he saw children of both races playing together. They did not know who had fought or died. They only knew that they were safe now, and that the humans had brought hope with them. Claire Hudson had been helping in the rebuilding of the hospitals. She worked every day from sunrise to sunset, treating the wounded and teaching the Nivari doctors how to use human medicine. She had grown thinner and more tired, but her eyes were bright with determination. Arlen worked beside her most days, carrying supplies or helping her translate with the locals. Their friendship had become something strong, built on trust and shared loss. Sometimes when they rested, she would tell him about Earth, the blue oceans, the wide forests, the music and laughter of cities. He listened with quiet wonder and said that one day his people would visit that world not as refugees but as friends. She smiled and said that they would be welcome there. The human fleet was still in orbit, but smaller. Now many ships had returned home carrying the remains of the fallen. Laura Mitchell's name was spoken with great respect. Her ship, the Horizon Dawn, was now a symbol of courage across both races. The Nivari had built a statue in the main square of the capital. It showed her standing with her hand raised toward the stars, her face calm and strong beneath. It were words in both languages saying she gave her light so we could see. Admiral Carter attended the ceremony and said that she would be remembered not as a soldier, but as someone who believed that compassion was stronger than fear. The Nivari sang their song of hope again, and for a moment it felt like the stars themselves were listening. But peace never stays easy. Even in the quiet times, messages from Earth began to grow colder. The Galactic Council had started to question why the humans had interfered. They said humanity had no right to fight without permission, and that their actions could cause more wars. Carter read those words in silence, and then deleted the message. He knew that what they had done was not about politics, it was about doing what was right. Still, he felt the weight of what was coming, because Earth was preparing to pull back its forces and leave the Nivari to rule themselves again. Claire was not happy when she heard this. She told Carter that they could not leave so soon because the Nivari were still learning. He said softly that he agreed, but orders were orders. One evening, Claire sat by the riverside with Arlen. The sun was low and the sky glowed orange. She told him that humans might have to go home soon. He looked sad but not surprised. He said that his people would keep learning and that they would not forget what the humans had done for them. She smiled and said that forgetting was impossible because their stories were now the same. They watched the water flow quietly between the stones, and for a long time, neither spoke. When the night came, the stars reflected on the river like tiny sparks of memory. A few days later, the evacuation began. Ships landed on the plains and crews started loading equipment and people. Carter stood by the transport ramp watching groups of Nivari gather to say goodbye. Many cried, others stood in silence with their heads bowed. Claire hugged Arlen and told him that she would come back someday, and that if he ever needed help, he should call her through the beacon they had built together. He said that he would keep it safe. She gave him a small silver pin with the emblem of her unit, and said that it was a symbol of friendship, one that never breaks. Arlen placed his hand over his heart and promised that it would stay with him forever. When the last ship lifted off, the Nivari waved until the fire from the engines disappeared into the clouds. The humans on board watched through the windows, some smiling, some crying. Claire sat beside Carter in the command room and asked him if he thought they did the right thing. He nodded slowly and said that he had never been more sure of anything in his life. He said that sometimes doing the right thing means standing alone, and that if the galaxy could not understand humanity's heart, then so be it. The journey home was long and quiet. The ships passed through empty space filled with broken satellites and the remains of battles. Long gone, Carter spent his time writing his report, not with military numbers but with words about courage and compassion. He ended it by saying that humanity had proven something not to the Council but to themselves, that they were a species that could still care for others even when it cost them everything. Months later, back on Earth, Claire visited a memorial by the ocean. It had the names of everyone who had fallen in the Nivari campaign. She found Laura Mitchell's name carved deep in the stone. She placed a single white flower by it and whispered that the Nivari were rebuilding and that their world was alive again. She said that maybe someday they would build their own ships and come to Earth not as the weak, but as the strong. She looked up at the stars and smiled because she could almost imagine Laura's voice telling her that it had all been worth it. Far away on the Nivari homeworld, Arlen stood on the same field where the battle had ended. Around him, new buildings. Rose and children played among trees that had grown where ashes once lay. He wore the silver pin on his chest every day. The beacon Claire gave him was still active, glowing softly in his home each night. When he looked at it, he remembered the faces of the humans who had fought and died for his people, and he told the young ones their stories. Sometimes they did not believe him at first, so he would take them to the statue of Laura Mitchell and tell them to look at her eyes. He would say those eyes belong to a human, and because of them we live. Years passed and the Nivari became strong. Their ships began to travel beyond their system, carrying trade goods and messages of peace to other worlds wherever they went. They spoke proudly of the humans who had once come when no one else would. They told of the battles, the friendships, and the sacrifice. Their story spread across the stars, inspiring other races to question their fear and learn kindness again. And in time, when the Nivari finally joined the Galactic Council, they placed the symbol of Earth beside their own flag in honor of those who had stood with them. Admiral Carter, who had long since retired, received one last transmission years later. It came from deep space, a signal from a Nivari scout ship. The message was simple. It said that they had found a new world and named it Dawn in memory of the ship that saved them. He read it slowly and felt his heart warm. He looked out the window at the night sky and whispered that maybe this was what it meant to be human. Not power or empire, but the will to care even when the universe turned away. He sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and smiled as the stars shone quietly above. The galaxy would remember that there had been a time when every species abandoned a helpless race except the humans, and that choice changed everything forever.